Without further ado, I'd like to invite our first keynote speaker, Professor Robert J. Sampson, to the podium. His topic is a network approach to neighborhoods, cities, and crime based on everyday urban mobility. Please help me welcome Professor Sampson. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've been to Korea. I've been to several Asian societies. First time here. I think I like it the best. So it's an awesome society so far. Hospitality has been wonderful, and I'm very glad to speak with you today about some research on neighborhoods and crime, which is something that I've been interested in for most of my research career. Let me just give an overview of kind of what I'd like to accomplish. I want mainly to put across an idea based on current research that I'm involved with. And I'm not going to focus a lot on details in terms of the specifics. Okay? I'm going to try to focus on the larger picture so that you get the general idea of what we're trying to accomplish in our work. So let me begin by describing an idea that occurred to me when I was doing the research and writing Great American City, Chicago, and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect. My research in that book led me to believe that neighborhoods are an important feature of spatial inequality, not just in American cities, but in all cities, and that cities are characterized by a great deal of differentiation by neighborhood. And in fact, the cover of the book, in a way, gives the thesis that cities are characterized by very different kinds of neighborhoods. There's a lot of spatial inequality, and that neighborhoods have effects on a wide variety of phenomenon, including crime. So the book was really about looking at neighborhoods over time and the relationship between neighborhoods and long-term patterns. Hence the idea of neighborhood effects, or really the enduring neighborhood effect. Now, I would argue that this is very relevant to the theme of this conference, which is evidence-based policy, because one of the long-standing features in criminology is the concentration of crime in places, whether it be neighborhoods or even places within neighborhoods. I'll come back to that. And so, while this is not a policy presentation, if we're going to have sound policy, we better understand the nature of how crime is distributed in time and place. However, one of the limitations of neighborhood research, I believe, as it goes back in the history of criminology, is the tendency to focus on the characteristics of that neighborhood, as if neighborhoods are isolated from other neighborhoods in cities or even the wider metropolis. And one of the things that I discovered when we were looking at how people move, that is residential mobility, people move, let's say, take up residence in a new neighborhood. This map here shows each neighborhood in Chicago, which is a little circle, and each line is a tie between a neighborhood based on someone moving. When I plotted this out, I thought to myself, this describes an emergent structure that characterizes the city, and it says that the characteristics of any one neighborhood are dependent on the connections to other neighborhoods in the city, okay? And that's the idea of neighborhood networks. You've probably all heard of a social network. People are tied to one another. the idea here is that neighborhoods are tied to one another differentially. And in Great American City, I spent a fair amount of time in the last part of the book talking about this kind of relationship and what I referred to as the higher order structure of the city. So this is really focusing now on the social structure of the metropolis. This could be applied, I would argue, and I'll come back to this, to any city, such as Seoul. People don't just live in a neighborhood. You're here now, you come from another place. Which leads me then to the main idea of this presentation, which is people don't just live in a neighborhood. And so I want to go now from residence where you live, and not just moving to another neighborhood that is changing your household, but everyday mobility based on going to work, shopping, visiting friends, you name it. People traverse or move about the metropolitan area. And what that means is that the idea of neighborhood is problematized. And in fact, there's a classic theory about neighborhoods based on social isolation, which says that the poor are socially isolated from the rest of the city because of segregation. Each circle or square in this figure here is a neighborhood currently where I live, Boston. That's why I put it up. And it's differentiated here by the type of neighborhood, which is less important now, but each purple line here is a connection between neighborhoods. I'll tell you how I measured it. And what this tells us is that there's this emergent structure in Boston whereby some neighborhoods are isolated, indeed. Notice these here. There really are no connections or very minimal connections. So people live in these neighborhoods, most of them are poor, but then they also don't travel to other neighborhoods, and people don't travel to them. And that is a different characteristic than just the characteristics of the neighborhood itself. That's the fundamental idea here. And I'm going to play this out for you and tell you how we measured it. And I think this is a new approach to at least my understanding of neighborhoods. So how do we measure them? Well, we measure it using what some people have called big data. I heard it referred to earlier. That, as you know, and Korea is a very advanced technological society. There's a digital revolution, and you all, my cell phone is in my down there where I was sitting, and we all carry around little mini computers, and through GPS systems, through cell phones, and through other means, we can track people. What we did is to use another version, which is Twitter, which millions and millions and millions of people use. Now, I don't happen to like Twitter. Some of the biggest users of Twitter I really don't like. But it does provide a data point on which to measure where people are. Now, if you look at this map of the United States, if you didn't know what this was, you would say, this really does capture the population pretty well, right? Here's the East Coast, dense, down there, Miami, Chicago, Southern California. But this is based simply on geocoded tweets. That is to say, using the platform of Twitter, people, again, there are billions of tweets, millions of users around the world, including low income. It's not just a phenomenon of the upper class. And there's a certain proportion of these that are geocoded, which means that we can take the location of that tweet. So if someone right now is tweeting, we know that you are here within 50 meters. So it's a very precise identification. Now, there's issues of representation that I'll come back to, but what we're claiming is that this forms a signal of mobility. So using these data, the first paper that we published on this just came out last year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, called Urban Mobility and Neighborhood Isolation in America's 50 Largest Cities. So we took a lot of data, and I'll show you how much, to represent these ideas. But I want to just show you what it's like for just one person, and I think it'll help you understand just how much connection there is across neighborhoods that established ties. This is one person who lives in the Boston area. Happens to live down here. I realize it's a little fuzzy. I apologize for that because I blew it up. This person lives here, and notice that all these neighborhoods or places that are these red pinkish dots is a place that this person visited. But they went up here, here, here. This is central South Boston, which is the Roxbury neighborhood. Lots of activity here, up through, this is Logan Airport. If you fly in, this is where you'll be, up in East Boston. But notice that there's huge areas that are not represented by travel. But there's hundreds of places that this person has visited. Now imagine we have this information for all the people that live in Boston. That's the idea. We don't have that data, but we can approximate it. So what we did is to take information like this, and it took us about 2.5 years because we had to get the exact location and estimate where people live, and then every single place they went and tweeted, we had to identify. And this is the data. It was 650 million geotag tweets, and we identified about 400,000 users. This is our map of New York City. I use this because it's a city that you probably know. And you can see that this density of estimated home locations represents very well the known population of the city. In fact, the correlation between our estimate of the population and the census is very, very high. You can see here is Manhattan, very dense blue. Here's the river. It's Manhattan here. This is the city of New York, and these are all the tweets. So what did we do? I'm not going to get into the details, but we used machine learning on these hundreds of millions of tweets to estimate the home location of a person from basically at night when people are sleeping, 5 nights a week. Then we spatially clustered them, and we identified the centroid. I won't get into that too much, but the point is that if you'll allow me to just make that assertion at this point, the details are in the paper. We can identify all these residents of New York and where they travel. Here's one person, lives in central Manhattan. These are all the places that person visits. And you can see here how this person doesn't like Queens or the Bronx or Staten Island. For whatever reason, it's almost never there. Almost all the activity is in southern Manhattan and then a little bit into New Jersey. If you look at this map, you can tell that we can estimate how far people travel, the number of neighborhoods they visit. You can see this person probably did about 50 neighborhoods. It's a lot. And this is done over a 2-year period of time. So it's not just 1 week. We're accumulating over a pretty long period of time. And then where they visit. So what's the finding from this paper? The finding, and this is a little bit surprising, is that there were no major differences in the distance traveled, the neighborhoods traveled by poverty or racial composition. So segregated neighborhoods, for example, people from low-income black neighborhoods in the United States, middle-income black neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, people from those neighborhoods traveled the same number of neighborhoods and traveled as far. So that, in a way, is a disconfirmation of my colleague William Julius Wilson's thesis that the poor, right, especially the minority poor, are isolated from the rest of the city. But he perhaps is wrong in another respect. The neighborhoods that were traveled to, the composition varied dramatically. And the best way I can try to show this is this figure, which I hope is pretty simple, but I'll explain it. Oops, let me go back here. This is the line of equality. This is based on adjusted to the city. So in other words, if people traveled randomly, that is no discrimination, you traveled the same as everyone else, this would be where you would be at. And what we're doing here is looking at the proportion of people from poor black, non-poor black, poor white, poor Hispanic, traveling to non-poor white neighborhoods. So in other words, is there an economic and racial distinction between where people travel? And it turns out that there's tremendous differences. So for example, these are non-poor whites. They tend to travel to, guess what? Other non-poor white neighborhoods. Way more than expected based on chance. These are hugely significant. These are the confidence intervals, and you can see that this is very significant. Non-poor black, about 40 percentage points less likely to travel to non-poor white neighborhoods. But notice this. Poor black and non-poor black, there's no difference. Same thing with Hispanic. There's a complete racial segregation, not complete, but there's a great deal of racial segregation in everyday mobility outside of the neighborhood. And we think that's an interesting finding, even though, remember, there's still similar travel patterns. So there is indeed travel outside the neighborhood. It's just that, think about it like this, that the segregation is being replicated in everyday life. Okay? Now hopefully that's clear. So I want to move on now to new research and tell you about two papers, because I like to present work I'm doing, and this is with a team. And it has to do with two ideas. One is at the city level, and looking at city level mobility and crime. And the idea here is as follows. Based on what I've just told you, you can now imagine the travel patterns across an entire city. Take Seoul. If you have this measure of the different travel patterns, a simple question is, how equitable are those travel patterns, right? I showed you in the 50 American cities, there seemed to be some racial differences and other differences, but that was based on individuals. What about the structure of mobility in the entire area? And so what I'm going to do now is change the focus a little bit and think about networks. So if you can imagine with me now where a city is comprised of a network of neighborhoods. And this is really a pretty simple idea, where the networks are the nodes and the ties, those lines I showed you between them, are the edges or the connections. So think of every neighborhood in Seoul or every place and its connections to every other place based on travel. And this is based on a paper that just came out in a couple months ago. It's widely available now in Sociological Methods and Research, called Social Integration of American Cities, Network-Based Connectedness based on the Everyday Mobility Across Neighborhoods. So it's a network paper. Now, it's very much focused on theory, though, and it's very relevant to criminology. You're probably familiar with Emil Durkheim, who was sort of one of the founding fathers, if you will, of criminological thought. And Travis Hershey, my mentor, very much relied on Durkheim. I mentioned this yesterday. We're moral beings to the extent we're social beings. He talked a lot about social integration. And the Durkheimian tradition basically says that socially integrated societies are those that are ones where there's more connection, so more social ties, social bonds among people. Social integration depends in part on opportunities for contact, right? Social integration is not just abstract. It's dependent on opportunities for contact. It's not guaranteed, but you must have contact. So the hypothesis is that inter-neighborhood mobility is a key source of connectedness and thus social integration. Okay, is everyone hopefully on board with that? The abstract conceptualization here of social integration is here now being operationalized by structural connectedness and the ability and the opportunity structures for people to contact one another. Now let me tell you how we measured it. It might seem a little different than something you're used to, but I'll show you, hopefully in a very simple way, what I mean, and then some of the key results. So we constructed two indices. One is called the Concentrated Mobility Index, and this is actually pretty simple. It's just the dispersion or the inequality across all neighborhoods in visits. So in other words, some neighborhoods, a lot of people are visiting. It's kind of like common shared space. You can think of the urban commons, maybe park, or areas around a library, or other areas where people from the city gather. You have a concentration of mobility. And the second is what we call the Equitable Mobility Index. And again, this is all in the paper. What we mean here is, and this is a neighborhood to neighborhood comparison. We compare every neighborhood in the city and how much it would have to change in order for there to be equitable exchange between all the neighborhoods. So it's actually reduced to a very simple thing. Ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 means that there is equitable mobility, that people are traveling based on chance, basically. I mean, it's sort of like an ideal, equitable mobility flow, whereas 0 is complete separateness. People are only visiting, basically only visiting their own neighborhood, and there's no connections. And you can see how this works in certain cities. This is the 50 largest cities. This is just the relationship between the two. And what you can see is there's not much relationship, that the equitable mobility is capturing something different. It's a real network measure of the overall equality of visits, and this is the extent to, again, it's concentrated. So Detroit, as an example, I'll highlight this. Detroit has very low equitable mobility, and it's very low on concentrated mobility, which means that there's no common spot where lots of residents of Detroit are going. So in a sense, it's kind of segregated in two ways. There's no common shared space, and people are kind of hunkered down, and they're only going to very few neighborhoods. That's a kind of social isolation at the structural level. Whereas places like San Francisco, San Francisco is very high on equitable mobility. New York has shared public spaces, but it's actually low in equitable mobility. And so our question is, how do these things work together? How do they predict crime? Here's just a map to see the results of how this works. And here you can see San Francisco. I pulled this up in part because the American Society of Criminology meetings were just there. The Union Square area, Financial District, Embarcadero, very common shared spots in Manhattan similarly. This kind of conforms with our expectations. Detroit, though, you see not many and a lot of blue spaces, which is a low degree of visitation. So, just to summarize here and tell you the bottom line result, here's our question. Do cities with equitable mobility and low concentrated mobility have higher crime rates? That's the question. That's the research question. The unit here is the city. So it's sort of macro level investigation. And it turns out that controlling for poverty, controlling for other characteristics of the city like size, like density, like education. In other words, the traditional criminological correlates of city crime rates and the racial segregation of the city, we find that the interaction of these two forms predicts violence. And I'll go back to that map of the cities. And now I've showing you the rate of homicide, one of our key criminological variables. It's measured well. This is adjusted after taking out the consequences of racial segregation, income segregation, city size, and so forth. Color-coded, red, as in a, that's the bad, that's the high rate of homicide. Green is low, and medium is yellow. And you can see that a lot of the red areas tend to kind of be in this quadrant. You almost run a line down that way. They tend to be down here. And in fact, the rate of homicide, mean rate of homicide in this quadrant, which is low equitable mobility and lack of shared common spaces of visitation, the mean homicide rate is 21.48 per 100,000, which is extremely high. It's more than double San Francisco and these other areas, which is 10.01. And even here, 11.5 and 11.64. Basically, these three are not that different, and this is the outlier. So in other words, we seem to have captured a characteristic of cities that is not the same thing as their poverty rate. It's not the same thing as their racial segregation. It's not the same thing as city size. The quality and the distribution of travel patterns and the connections among neighborhoods across cities is predicting its violence rate. That is a finding that has not been seen before, we think, in criminology. We think it's interesting. We think it's relevant. And it, to me, suggests that there is this quality of social integration that matters at the structural level. Now I want to tell you about a second project that's going to go down a little bit to the neighborhood level, like mostly what I did in Great American City. So if you can now shift, and hope I'm not going too fast here. Now imagine you're looking at a neighborhood or a unit or a community within a city and its crime rate. And, oops. Yeah. I'm going to skip that one. And this is what we're calling triple disadvantage. Let me walk you through this figure for a second. You all know, or you can imagine a neighborhood that's poor. Okay. This is the traditional low income, inner city, high poverty neighborhood, however you want to think about it. But the dark areas here are the disadvantaged neighborhoods. The light gray are middle class neighborhoods, and these are advantaged. The difference here in what we're calling triple disadvantage is as follows. The neighborhood is poor. It's only visited by people from poor neighborhoods. This is a hypothetical situation. And the residents of this neighborhood are only, when they travel, in contact with other poor or disadvantaged neighborhoods. Okay? Has everyone got that? In other words, it's poor. The residents visit other poor neighborhoods, and the visitors into the neighborhood, or the in-degree, are poor themselves. That is a new way to think about characteristics of neighborhood that also takes into account all the travel patterns that I've been mentioning. And we consider this to be triple disadvantage. There are also triple advantage, and you probably know some of the areas right here in Seoul, right? These are areas that are rich. The people only visit other rich neighborhoods. And guess what? The people that visit that neighborhood come from rich neighborhoods. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense that that's what inequality is. I mean, that in the extreme, right, where there's no contact across different groups in a society. So the neighborhood or the local phenomenon is being reinforced by these travel differences. So that's the phenomenon of triple disadvantage. And I want to show you what it looks like, and you really can see the differences. This is New York City, famous example in the city you may know. These dark areas are areas that are poor, disadvantaged. And there's quite a lot of them, particularly up here in the Bronx and in Brooklyn and Queens. But we argue that that's misleading, right? Because going back to what I said at the beginning, this is sort of like the truly disadvantaged, the notion that people live in poor neighborhoods, so they're automatically disadvantaged. If you look at triple disadvantage, it changes quite a bit. All these disappear, not all of them, but look at that dark, dense here area. Many of them are now only in the lower ranges. It's the Bronx that stays pretty much the same. What this is telling us is that many of these areas, which appear to be poor, are only residentially poor, but they don't have that compounded double and triple disadvantage. The theoretical hypothesis, then, is that triple disadvantage is a predictor of violence and crime beyond the simple residential disadvantage. That's the theoretical hypothesis of the paper that we are working on. And you can see the same thing happens in Boston, where you have very dense areas. For those of you who know the city, you can see almost an entire quadrant running from downtown all the way down here, whereas it only collapses into a relatively small area, which is at least descriptively an area of intense violence in Boston. So the question now is, are we right? So what do we have to do? Well, we have to control and adjust for characteristics that we know in criminology are related to crime and violence rates. We also have to control for spatial disadvantage, because it could be that these neighborhoods that are triply disadvantaged, right, the effects on crime are just because neighborhoods are segregated and they tend to be next to neighborhoods that are poor, and that could account for the difference. I will show you that that's not the case. First of all, neighborhoods in Boston and in the 50 largest cities that we're analyzing are shown to be, I'm going to skip that, very much related to triple disadvantage. And this is just a simple, hopefully simple graph that shows the predicted rate of homicide adjusted for the characteristics that I was mentioning in terms of other characteristics, whether it be education, location in the city, spatial disadvantage, and simply comparing what is the relationship between our traditional measure of poverty or neighborhood disadvantage, and that's this line here, and these are the confidence intervals on predicting homicide, and this is triple disadvantage. And it turns out that it is not only a significant predictor, but it adds value to our prediction of homicide. It's about a 30% greater rate. So that's a quite substantial prediction. This also holds for Chicago. It also holds for Los Angeles. We were curious as to whether or not the results maybe across all these cities were somehow being driven by one or two cities. So we wanted to show, well, what does this look like in some of the largest cities in the United States? Chicago and Los Angeles are the second and third largest cities. And you see the exact same pattern. And what about Boston? Here, this is gun violence. If you want to know about gun violence in a city, it turns out that what we've been doing all these years, looking at neighborhood poverty, doesn't do nearly as well as the effect of looking at triple disadvantage. Again, this is poverty, and this is triple poverty or triple disadvantage. So really what this is suggesting, to build off of the famous work by William Julius Wilson that has been very influential in criminology, his book was titled The Truly Disadvantaged. Well, it seems like the truly disadvantaged are the triply disadvantaged, right? It's not just that you live in a poor neighborhood, because people living in poor neighborhoods are exposed, they're traveling as far as others to as many neighborhoods, but the circulation flows are creating, through this network process, a higher order form of segregation, and it is impacting crime. To me, that means that criminological neighborhood research, which I've been involved with for years and years, needs to rethink how it goes about business. So let me conclude with some conceptual thoughts on that and some implications. First, I would submit to you that mobility-based connectedness, the first project that I talked about, is a new perspective on city crime patterns. And this is a long tradition in criminology to understand, why does Detroit have a higher crime rate than Boston? It's a macro level question. Or why does Seoul have a lower crime rate than some other city in Korea? This is a venerable tradition, yet the kinds of characteristics that we've typically been considering, I think, are missing an important piece. And in this world of connectedness, right, in transportation, this, I believe, is important and will play an important role in future research. And at the neighborhood level, I would argue the triple neighborhood disadvantage is an important explanation of neighborhood violence. Now, this first argument about mobility-based is based on a paper that will be coming out. The second is on a paper that's currently completed. I'd be happy to send you copies. It's under the review process. So this is, again, work in progress, and this is where we're going and what we think is happening. So what now would I say are, in conclusion, because I see that I have, I think, 3 minutes left, 3 to 5 minutes, and I want to keep on time. What are some of the implications in future research? Well, one thing that we're currently doing is looking at the reciprocal relationship, because violence can also affect mobility patterns, right? And so what we want to do is look at a more longitudinal analysis, and that is currently what we are doing. Secondly, triple disadvantage and additional outcomes. So I would posit that this is also important. Now, if you think about what are some of the key controversies and things that we study in crime and justice: public disorder, drug use, assault, substance abuse, gangs. These criminological phenomenon, I think, are very much tied, because gangs, for example, I don't know what gangs are like in Seoul, but gangs in Chicago, you probably don't have any. Good for you. You have lower crime than US. Good for you for that, too. Gangs are connected. They don't just stay in a neighborhood. They're across community gangs, and the networks of the gangs and their travel patterns bear on where crime occurs. Drug distribution networks. Most crime is not simply about where it occurs. The causal forces are going across neighborhood boundaries. Furthermore, my work on collective efficacy in great American cities, and I moved beyond it today, but I still believe it's an important social phenomenon. I think we can also think about how neighborhood networks help us understand collective efficacy. There's some research, for example, that shows that people in a neighborhood that also visit other places in the neighborhood, that is, use the public space in the neighborhood, and go to other neighborhoods in a shared way, that is, they share visitation patterns, have higher collective efficacy. It's a paper by Christopher Browning. And that's a really fascinating finding. It kind of like those of you who know about Jane Jacobs and her work on the death and life of great American cities. She argued that their eyes on the street, that people on the street are an important deterrent to crime. Well, that's in a way what I've been measuring, right? All those visitations, those are people in a neighborhood, and we now have tools to measure that in a way that we didn't before. So 2 more implications. This then causes us to rethink, I believe, the so-called law of crime concentration. I don't think it's a law. I think it's socially variable. And I think that we don't even really know how much crime is concentrated, because what's the right way to think about it? If there's a lot of people in a space and crime is concentrated there, then in a way the crime rate is very different than it would be under our traditional model, right? Because you see those neighborhoods where there's lots of people visiting. Manhattan has 12 million or 10, 12 million people coming into that part of the city every day, but there's only 2.5 million residents. Well, what's the crime rate? The right denominator for the crime rate is not the residential population. So in other words, this whole way of thinking makes us question what a crime rate is, and it says that the macro level approach is central to criminology. And finally, I think there's policy implications, because I think that the new technology and big data, first of all, can help us predict hotspots and inform interventions, because we now have the ability in real time, through all this technology, to know where people are in all the different flows, which is a huge difference from traditional criminology. And I think that will help us. And I think in terms of police patrols, you can imagine, well, if you're a police chief, you don't want to just know about the crime incidents. You want to know about the structure of the flows where crime is about to occur. And in fact, police are on this in terms of their management of when people are at concerts and so forth. That's the easy example. But this is more like the everyday congregation, particularly among youth, which I think could be predicted better than we know. Drug markets, gun violence. I think there's a whole way in which we can take advantage of these new tools to inform crime policy. To me, that's evidence-based. It's not a specific intervention. It's how criminological theory of the kind that I am involved with, I think, can inform future research. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I hope you got a glimpse of the current and future research trajectory of myself and my team, and I would be glad to discuss it further and send you papers. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here.